Next person up to talk to all of us today is Rachel Andrew, continuing the secret CSS Day theme of British authors. It won't continue forever, don't worry. She's widely celebrated across all sorts of web stuff. She's a proud member of the CSS Working Group, member of the Web Standards Project, editor of Smashing Magazine, a Google developer expert, so many other things, and right now, more recently, a Googler as well, like me. Yay! She's authored or co-authored 23 books. Did I look that up right? It's ridiculous, Rachel. It's so good.
It is.
Latest one is the new CSS layout. Something near and dear to my heart. It's all about grid layout. Give that a read because I wrote the spec. That doesn't mean I know very much about how to use it all the time. So people who've actually spent time working on that, they're the people you should be listening to. Today, though, she's going to be talking about a cross-browser effort that's been some time in the making, Interop 2022. Bring it up for Rachel Andrew.
It is very, very nice to be here with you all. I hope you're all really well. So yeah, I'm Rachel Andrew. I know so many of you here. And yeah, these days I'm actually a technical writer on the Chrome DevRel team at Google. And I kind of got offered a job which was just like my dream job. I never thought of myself as going into a big company, but I got offered the chance to create great resources basically for web developers on our sites, web.dev and developers.chrome.com. And that kind of was like a perfect match for someone who's written 23 books. And so I took the job and I'm really enjoying it. And I'm just kind of hoping we've got these shoes that we made and we put these Chrome logos on them, but they're not very sticky. So the challenge is whether I get through the talk before the logo falls off my shoes. We'll see how it goes. But anyway, I'm repeating what Jeremy said with this slide. It is so exciting right now in our world. There's so much stuff landing in browsers. We've just seen like Cascade Layers landed cross-browser, and there's much more to come this year. So there's so much happening. And it's also landing in browsers in a more robust and interoperable way than ever before. Interoperable. As well as a word that's really hard to say on stage, it's really important because it means that a feature works, and it works in the same way across browsers. So you can use some CSS and you can develop in your favorite browser, whatever that is, and be confident when you open up another browser, it's going to look exactly the same. It wasn't always this way. You couldn't rely on things at the most basic of levels, how the width of a box was calculated. So at one point, now if you're old like me, you'll remember that we had two browsers, Internet Explorer and Netscape, and they calculated the box model differently. So Netscape used the standard box model as we know it today, as if you're using box sizing content box. And Internet Explorer used the alternate, as if you were using box sizing border box. But the box sizing property didn't exist, so you couldn't do anything about it to normalize the two. Other than via this box model hack, our CSS was full of beautiful bits of code like this to try and get round problems like that. And be glad if you've not opened up your site in another browser to realize that everything is a different size. And interoperability, although we didn't call it that at the time, that was what the Web Standards Project were really campaigning for back in the day. We wanted standard things to work in a standard way. We weren't saying that browsers can't innovate, or browsers can't come up with, cool, new, interesting things, or do stuff with, with their engine. We were saying that if you've got a standard thing with a spec, everyone should be complying with it. And we pretty much have that today. We have that. Most things work in exactly the same way cross-browser. So we're not seeing that kind of showstopper issue, but we do see some problems because, browsers are just software, and software sometimes has bugs. And particularly when we're talking about CSS, CSS is really complicated. Although the language itself, is quite straightforward looking a lot of the time. It's written by people who sometimes don't actually know what they're doing, and so they write terrible CSS, and the browser still has to render it. Or they write awful HTML that the CSS is, has to try and work with because, it's got things badly nested and all sorts going on, and the browsers have to try and cope with that. CSS has to render content that is written in, any possible language and different script directions and, different writing modes. Sometimes multiple languages on one page. And CSS still has to allow those websites that were written 20 years ago, I think I've probably got a couple still out there, they still have to work, and they do. This is not simple stuff. It is not surprising that sometimes things just go wrong. But the other thing that's happening today is that new browser versions are being released really quickly. Firefox and Chrome are both on a monthly release cycle. Safari is landing features in updates, between major versions as well. Now, if you contrast this to the gap of 5 years between IE 6 and 7, the web just stopped. Nothing new really happened for 5 years. And now every month, I write a monthly post on web.dev about things that are new in the web platform. And there's plenty of content. In fact, I just have to pick my favorites because there's so much stuff landing all the time. So we're getting these new features more quickly. But, each browser has to kind of figure out the priorities, what they're going to focus on. I think people are often quite surprised at how small the teams are within browsers. And particularly, the engineers who have the actual knowledge to work with the web platform. They're quite small teams. And so, each browser is having to figure out, well, which things are we going to work on? What are the priorities? And so with every new feature that, the CSS working group develops or what have you, we get a gap. We get a gap between the feature landing in the first browser, which quite often would be the browser that maybe has put the work in on the spec and has done all the initial thinking and sort of experimental implementations. And then we have to wait for the others to catch up. Now, people on Twitter will often point the finger at one particular browser and say, hey, they're really slow. But when you look at it, it's actually spread out across the browsers. Different browsers take the lead on different features. And then, the other engines have to kind of follow up and add to that. And so when we talk to web developers, when we talk to people like you, we hear very clearly that making websites and applications work well across browsers is the hardest thing. It's the hardest thing that you have to do. Even today, even after all of these years, even after the fact that actually browsers do care about interoperability and aren't sort of doing random things, differently to each other, it's still difficult. So this is the State of CSS survey. Browser compatibility is top of the list. This is the MDN Developer Needs Assessment. Interoperability across browsers, top of the list. And here's some research conducted at Google. We survey web developers. And again, making a designer experience work the same across browsers, that's the top challenge. People are finding this stuff hard. And it's not because people who work at browsers or even the companies themselves don't care. Every browser wants to be better. Every browser engineer wants to make their browser better. Everyone wants to improve the platform for developers. I now work for a browser, and it's all we hear. We want to make things better for developers. But if each browser chooses a different set of features to implement, we could make it even worse. Because it's not helpful if one browser has container queries, another one gets Subgrid, and a third fixes all the really annoying Flexbox bugs. We still have this gap. We still have this kind of fragmentation of support of the platform. And developers are left in exactly the same place because, for most of you, you care about your sites working across browser. And so each browser picking different things and making them really good could just potentially not improve the situation at all. We just have a lot of things that people would stand on stage and say, hey, look, you can try this in Firefox. You can try this one in Chrome. And developers are going, well, that's lovely. Come back to me once it is in all three major engines. So to try and deal with this situation, last year, Google began working with some of the other browsers and with industry partners as well to try and fix the things that were coming up as the kind of major browser compatibility woes, the things we were really hearing from developers, we were seeing, the bugs starred and so on. So this was Flexbox, grid, position sticky, aspect ratio, and CSS transforms. So different issues with those things. How can we make them better? And this was actually a really great success. A lot of issues and missing features were implemented across Chromium, Gecko, and WebKit. So across all of the browsers, the web got better. So that was great. There were some really good wins out of that. And so for 2022, the browser vendors thought, well, how can we make this better? How can we build on this success? And everyone got together again, and this time the sort of prioritization effort was done by all of the browser vendors and by other industry partners, people like Igalia, who do a lot of implementation for the web platform, worked together and figured out what are the things that need fixing, along with what is actually feasible to fix. What can we actually do this year to make the web better? So there was a kind of robust process. It's all open. You can go and have a look at it on the repo, where everyone was discussing and figuring out which things to work on. And this created the areas for the project known as Interop 2022. So this is basically an effort to improve the experience of developing for the web in 15 key areas. Now you can follow along on the dashboard. This is all happening in the open. And of course, we're already, halfway through 2022. So you can go along, have a look at the dashboard. And this week, it had scores like this for the browsers. Now, these are the experimental browsers. So we've got Chrome Dev, Firefox Nightly, and Safari Technology Preview. And you can toggle and have a look at the scores for the stable version, so the actual shipping versions with features there that users can actually get their hands on. So these are the current scores. And, obviously this is changing all the time, but you can follow along. So I think what's interesting, if we look at the breakdown here, this is on the same dashboard, the breakdown of current scores, it really highlights this fragmentation of support across browsers. It's really not that one browser is far behind the others in all areas. Each has a better score in different areas. So color spaces and functions, for example, Safari is at 91% and Firefox and Chrome were at 52 and 51%. So Safari is kind of in the lead there. Subgrid has Chrome way behind, only 17%, because it's not landed in Subgrid's not landed in Chrome yet. Viewport units, however, get 100% score for Chrome, and Firefox and Safari, have got a lower score. So as I say, it's not that sort of one browser is lagging behind. It's that everybody's sort of worked on different things because of these priorities. And so before looking at some of the features that we're exploring here and that we're improving, I want to talk a bit about where these scores actually come from, how we're working them out, and also so you can go and explore the data for yourself, so you can see what's being included. Now, these scores are all based on passing web platform tests for the features. So we've got this web platform test project. If you've heard me talk before, I've probably mentioned it in other talks, which is really, actually tests for the web platform. So if you're a browser engineer and you're implementing a feature in a browser, you can check that that feature is passing all the tests. And if it's passing all the tests, that hopefully means it's interoperable with the other browsers, the other implementations. So this is a really useful suite of tests. And ideally, everything would have, tests so that it can be robustly tested. So for things to be part of this project, part of Interop 2022, they had to have a good test suite, because that's what we're relying on to get the scores. Now, if we dive into any of the areas that are listed on the table, we'll get a list of the available tests for that area. Now, so you can have a look there and you can see that here this feature has got lots of red, lots of failing tests. Now, that might be because the feature isn't implemented at all, or that it's got some bug. There's, one of these tests is showing a problem. And you can see these are all in the experimental browsers there at the top of the table. So you can drill down from the dashboard and see this. And then you can also see on the left there are the actual tests that are being run. If you click on any of the individual tests, you can get a bit more detail about the test. And you can also view the source of an individual test. So while we're here, these tests, a lot of them, particularly for CSS, are really, really simple. They are just like ref tests. It's like, does this look like that? They're very, very simple to write. And there's lots of missing tests for CSS features. Some specs have got really good test suites, others not so good. And this is a really great way to contribute to improving the web platform, is to write tests. A lot of people who work on CSS started out by writing tests, so it's a good way to kind of really get in depth with how a spec works. This test is written by one of my fellow speakers and Googlers, Adam Argyle. There's a lot of people here would be very happy to tell you how to get started contributing to the web platform by writing tests. It's a very useful thing to do. And, it helps us because if we're going to have efforts like Interop 2022, we need the tests in order to be able to check that things actually work. So that's kind of how browsers are being assessed. That sort of the number of tests is sort of broken down, turned into a score, and then that can then be sort of assessed against each browser how well they're doing. Now, I thought we'd have a look at some of the features. What's coming? What are we going to get because of Interop 2022? It's going to be a very quick fly through some of these things. That a lot of them have actually been talked about by other speakers later in this conference. I've also included some demos, which you can, I've tweeted the link out, and you can have a look at the sort of demos if you want to play around with any of these things. So I already mentioned the Compat 2021. Now, the features that were part of Compat 2021, there was still a few outstanding issues from those, although, that project did incredibly well. It got things, quite a long way. And there were still a few outstanding issues, so they've kind of been wrapped up into the Interop 2022 fold to make sure they're kind of finished off, that we end up with them really solid and robust. So that's on this here, you can see those features, and you can see the scores are pretty good for those things. So some of the cool things that are possible due to the focus on these features, already in the last sort of year and a half. We've got the aspect ratio property and the related ability to map the width and height attribute on images to that property so that we can avoid having those nasty layout shifts that you get. You've got no width and height on images, which we stopped doing with responsive design because we were like, well, we're going to have squishy images, so we'll stop giving them a width and height in HTML. The problem with that is you then end up with the browser can't figure out how big the things are, and so your page loads, then the images load in really slowly and cause jumps and jiggles as they load in. Because that we're sort of mapping the aspect ratio into this property, you can actually, if you add your height and width onto your images again, you benefit from a performance enhancement. You don't get that jiggliness. That's pretty cool. But you can also use the aspect ratio property from CSS. Now, this is fantastic. This solves the problem that we've had for years, where it's fine if you use an image. Images have an intrinsic aspect ratio or a video directly embedded. It's got an aspect ratio. The browser understands it. It displays it properly. The problem comes when you want to embed a video on the page that is on YouTube or somewhere else. You want to embed it. You've got a div. The div has no aspect ratio, and so you have to kind of give it a fixed height, and then, well, it's got a squishy width, and then it all ends up a weird size. And so we've been sort of using this sort of padding trick to sort of fake aspect ratios, and that's terrible. And I really love tidying things up on the web. I think, these little features that just like make a small thing better, I think are great. And that's what, the aspect ratio property does. It lets you say, hey, look, this thing is 16 by 9. Please give me a 16 by 9 box. Don't squish it. And that's what it does. It's cool. So it solves the iPhone problem. So I've got sort of two grid tracks here, so they're flexible, and I've got the boxes with the aspect ratio, and the boxes maintain that aspect ratio. Their width is defined by the track they're in, and the height by the ratio. That's pretty cool. I think it can definitely be used for other sort of interesting things, especially when we combine it with all that nice, flexible, squishy sizing in grid. I think, aspect ratio is a really useful thing to sort of do some quite interesting creative stuff. So this is a little demo. I've got an element here. I've got 3 images and a fig caption. I've given the images a 1:1 aspect ratio, so they're going to be square no matter what. And I then use grid to overlay the caption across the 3. And so I've got DevTools here, so you can kind of see how the grid works out. And as I say, defining aspect ratios can really help to avoid layout shift. If you know how big a part of your layout is going to be, using aspect ratios, you can sort of stop things from jumping around as stuff is loading. And then we've got this internal mapping as well. So the last few fixes are really just going to make sure this is as robust as it can be. It's the sort of property you want to be able to just set and forget and know that you can rely on. And then we have Flexbox. And obviously, Flexbox has been around for quite a long time, but it's got a bit of a reputation for being a little bit fragile and buggy at times. I think that's part of because of its history and how it landed in browsers, but there definitely were a bunch of issues, particularly around things like alignment and so on, that people were running into. And I sort of get questions. We say, why does this look like that? And what's going on here? There were also things from the box alignment spec which were missing from Flexbox. So one of those, a sort of a highly wanted feature, was the gap property for Flexbox. Because the big problem with GAP is that you couldn't use feature queries to detect a lack of it, because of course GAP is supported in grid layout. So if you, sort of with your feature queries check for, GAP 1M, the browser's like, yep, yeah, you've got that. But what it meant is you've got it in grid, but, it's available generally, but you couldn't check for, do you have GAP in Flex layout? There's no way to ask the browser that. So it was really problematic. So developers really wanted that, and we got that, which is useful. We also got the values of start, end, self-start, and self-end, left and right. Now, the sort of self-start, self-end, they're really useful if you do content which is displayed in both left to right and right to left languages. In my notes is a sort of write-up of the differences between these. But basically, the values of start and end are flow relative and relate to the writing mode of the container. The values self-start and self-end are also flow relative, but relate to the writing mode of the subject, so, the flex item. So they're really useful for people who are working with stuff that's being translated into things with different writing modes, and they were included. And then there's sticky positioning. Position sticky is, again, one of those sort of nice little features that showed up to fix something that people were typically doing with JavaScript. That ability to have stuff that's stuck in place. But it wasn't behaving very well everywhere. And in fact, you couldn't make in Chrome table headers and footers sticky. And that's like a really obvious use case. Because if you want to have like an Excel spreadsheet-like thing with the header stuck, that just wasn't working. So that was fixed in Chrome, as Chrome 91, that was fixed, and we started to be able to use those sticky headers and footers. Very, very useful. That was it was largely enabled by tables ng. That resolved 72 different tables-related Chromium issues. And that was like a real rewrite of the engine. It's part of the rendering ng project. And that's a rewrite of the rendering engine in Chromium, which is enabling a huge amount of the things that we think are very exciting today. Things like container queries that, you were told forever would not be possible, are really only being made possible by this sort of rewrite of the engine. Just huge numbers of bugs and things have been fixed, and say lots of things made possible. If you're interested, on developer.chrome.com, there is a huge series of deep dives into rendering ng and the different parts of that project. If you're a bit of a browser nerd, a CSS nerd, I think there's probably a few of those here. Read those posts. They're very, very interesting in terms of, actually all that went into this project to actually make rendering better. So we're fixing a few little issues that are left over, but now we've also got new features that were chosen specifically for Interop 2022. So here's the list and their current standing. As I say, earlier this week, this is what it was looking like in the different browsers. So Cascade Layers. They were one of those things that just kind of like went, ta-da, it's in all the browsers at once. And that's really exciting when that happens. We like that. And that's why, all the scores are over 95% right now. There's a few things to fix there. That's really exciting. I think the Cascade has been something that people have typically struggled with, particularly working in large teams or when you're wanting to work with a framework and your own CSS. Jeremy mentioned a bit of that earlier. It's the sort of feature that you really can't use unless it's everywhere. Because it's so fundamental. So it's really great. I think it's a real game changer. For it to land everywhere at once is amazing. So you can now, group your styles into a layer and manage how that fits in the Cascade. I think it's a very sensible, elegant solution to this problem. I'm not going to talk too much about that because my colleague Bramas is going to give you all the details in his talk here at CSS Day. But as Jeremy said, I think it's a game changer for CSS. I think it's hugely important, particularly for the way that people are developing websites today. It gets us away from the past where we were kind of like, one person writing a style sheet from top to bottom. That's not how websites are built now. We all know that. And I think this is one of those features that is going to make things easier for people who are, out there in the real world building CSS in the way that people do it today. And then we have color spaces and functions. Now, there's some really cool stuff in here. This isn't my area of expertise, but I do have a copy of this poster on my wall at home. Because if you've been doing CSS or web stuff for long enough to have spotted that box model hack, you probably also remember having to design using web-safe colors. We had a palette of 216 colors. And we had those colors. They were what was displayed consistently across major browsers at the time. It was fantastic back then. Nothing was the right size. We had 216 colors and about 6 fonts. Things aren't that bad now, but we have been tied to sRGB, and that is changing. So color spaces such as lab are coming to the web. Now, I'm not an expert in these things. I'm utterly baffled by most of the conversations about them, but I know who is, and you're in luck because he's here to talk to you. Chris Lilly is going to be here, and he's going to tell you all about how we're escaping the sRGB prison and help you to understand things like lab and OK Lab color spaces. So that's going to be a really good talk to listen to. Now, the new color spaces can also be used in a couple of new color functions. Now, I really love these. I think these are fantastic. And I'm really glad they're part of Interop 2022. So we've been using color functions in things like SAS for a long time, making things lighter and so on. It's kind of a sensible thing to want to do. If you're designing in a graphic design tool, you do that kind of thing all the time. It's something that we'd quite like to have in CSS. And the color functions would let us do that dynamically in CSS. And again, my background is a CMS developer. I'm very well used to people wanting to dynamically change themes, for example, from an admin panel, which is actually really, really difficult if you don't have sort of dynamic, color functions and so on. So really exciting, I think. We've got color mix, and that takes 2 colors and returns the result of mixing them in a specified color space by a specified amount. So here, what I'm doing is I'm mixing, increasing amounts of white into dark blue using LCH. Now, at the moment, this only works in Safari, and you need to toggle a flag to see it. But if you have a look in Safari, you can see you get this sort of effect. So I think that's going to be just really nice. Being able to mix colors dynamically, very, very useful. And for the people doing theming, I think color contrast is going to be super useful because you can select from a list of color the one with the highest contrast to a specified single color. So you don't end up with this issue of, if you've got people changing the background of stuff, you don't end up with text that then doesn't have enough contrast. And that works a bit like this. So I can change the background, and then it's going to pick whether white or black is the most contrasty. To hopefully get a decent view depending on what the background color is. Again, you can try this out in Safari, and you have to enable a flag at the moment. But because this is part of Interop 2022, hopefully we're going to see it across browser. And you can fall back to an existing color. It's the sort of thing that in a lot of places you'd be able to use as an enhancement fairly quickly, because you can fall back to just one color if you need to. And then we have containment. And this isn't container queries part of Interop 2022. We've got a little way maybe to go before that's everywhere, although, it seems to be picking up pace. But containment with the contain property gives you a way to tell the browser that some or all parts of the layout are independent for the rest. Particularly useful for your single page web apps, where you're changing a lot of stuff with JavaScript. If you can say, hey, look, this thing never changes. You don't need to recalculate it. That can be a good hint to the browser where it can make a performance enhancement. So that's pretty useful. It's useful optimization, and it lets the browser know your intentions, because for a lot of things, it's difficult for the browser to figure out what we're trying to do. Whereas you know as the author, this is never changing. I'm never touching this, and so then the browser can sort that out for you. And so if you're doing that kind of thing, it's worth using the contain property. So Interop 2022 is going to fix some outstanding issues with containment. But this is important to container queries because that's kind of based on this idea. It's a fundamental part of that. So we obviously need, if we want to get our container queries, we're going to want them to be really, really robust. We don't want them to be flaky. And so this is a kind of part of that helps to get us nearer. And then we have the dialogue element. Now, this gives us a way to create those sort of modal dialogues that web applications tend to need. And it comes with the JavaScript API for opening and closing things, and the backdrop pseudo class for styling the backdrop behind the dialogue. It's got pretty good browser support already, seeing MDN. So, all browsers have got scores in the 90s for this one right now. So the final work is just to kind of tidy up some outstanding issues. Again, these things become really key parts of applications. We want to make sure they're working really well. My colleague Adam, getting his second shout out today, is got a really nice tutorial on web.dev showing how to kind of build on top of that element, what you can actually do with that element, sort of design it really nicely. And then we have forms. Now, what could we say about forms? There are many things we could fix about forms. Unfortunately, this isn't fix everything that is terrible about forms, but it is fix a small pile of issues that make forms hard. A good way to find out what's included is to poke around the web platform tests that are included for this area if you want to actually see what is being fixed. You can also read, and for all of the features, there are discussions on GitHub where what is included is discussed. And they can be quite interesting. If you're wondering kind of the thought process, why was one thing picked and not another, you might be able to find out a bit in those sort of threads. So yeah, lots of little bits in forms. Again, each of these things, something that then you won't run into in the future. And then we have a whole bunch of issues that relate to scrolling on the web. Now, these came up in a 2021 survey on scrolling created by some of my colleagues. So here's the scroll survey report. You can have a look at the results on web.dev. Now, Interop 2022 is aiming to fix issues around overscroll behavior and scroll snapping. Now, I'm not going to dig into this too much because Adam's going to be on stage talking about scroll snap later here at CSS Day. We really are sort of digging into a lot of these features sort of in depth. But then we come to a cause that is dear to my heart, Subgrid. Long-awaited Subgrid. It's already in Firefox. It's been in Firefox for a long time, but, pretty much no one's using it because, well, it's only in Firefox. And it's a bit difficult to use layout mechanisms. There's a few kind of enhancement things you can do with it, but generally, you're not going to tie your layout to something which is only in one browser typically. So we're not sort of seeing a lot of use of it at the moment. It's in Safari Technology Preview now. I believe it's shipping in Safari 16, so it's on the way there. It's also under development for Chrome. The work is being done by the Microsoft team. So hopefully, because it's part of Interop 2022, we are going to get Subgrid into our hands. I think it's going to unlock a whole bunch of layout things that I'm really excited about. I think, people think of Subgrid as the sort of very obvious, just sort of, oh, well, I've got a grid, I would like the things to line up, that aren't direct children. But there's a bunch of interesting layout patterns, I think, that Subgrid enables. I'm just going to show you a couple of them, and they're in my resources. You can have a play around with them. We've got this interesting pattern that lets us target, like a full width or a main column by name by using the fact that you can name lines, which kind of gives you a named area of the line names with start and end knocked off. I've written about this in the past if you want to find the resources. This is really cool. And the nice thing with Subgrid is the line names inherit down into the subgrid. So that's really handy because then what we can do is we can have like a full width area, for example, and then we've got, sort of half width areas or main content areas above and below. But then we've got a nested item which we want to line up with those inside our full width area. And Subgrid will let us do things like that. So we get patterns like this, basically, with very little CSS. So I think that's going to be quite useful. I think playing around with Subgrid and the named lines stuff is going to be very, very useful. And that's something to explore. Now, Subgrid also lets us get around a really tricky problem with grid. One of the things people often say to me is, why is grid not working the same for rows as it is for columns? And what they've tried to do is they've tried to span something from line 1 to line -1, which they've done for columns, and it's worked nicely. They've tried to do it for rows, and it doesn't work. And the reason it's not working is that it only works for the extrinsic grid tracks. So the things that you've specified with grid template columns and grid template rows. So typically what people do is they specify their columns with grid template columns, and they just let as many items as they've got fill up the rows. And so you get these intrinsic rows, and you can't span with -1 to the end line because we don't know how many there are. So you just can't do that. So with Subgrid, what you can do is you can place all of your, if you've got something you want to be like a navigation bar, for example, that you want to be full height, to go from 1 to -1. If you put all your items that are going to create the rows into another wrapper and then use Subgrid to inherit the grid on the parent down into those, you essentially end up with a 1-row grid with the big tall thing and then the box with all the things that are creating the rows next to it. And so you can end up with this sort of pattern, and you don't need to specify how many rows you've got to get that 1 to -1 effect. So I think, again, there's lots of things that we can start to explore with Subgrid, and I think it's going to really fix some of the problems that people are having with grid and with as they're digging into grid layouts that we're starting to see through. I think a lot of those actually come down to we really need Subgrid, and I think we're going to get it fairly soon because of this project. So then there's a note about typography and encodings. Now, a lot of this is around encodings for its tests that are mostly around typography for CJK, so Chinese, Japanese, and Korean characters. For example, the IC unit. So if you know about the CH unit, that represents the advanced measure of the 0 character in the font used to render it. The IC unit represents the advanced measure of the CJK water ideograph, which enables measurements sort of based on an expected glyph count, basically. So things here might be less useful if, you're a Western person building sites for the West, which I guess most people here, I know at least one person isn't, most people here are. But I think that, there's part of the world that this sort of stuff is going to be incredibly useful for. And it's great to see those improvements that make the web truly international. I think, it's been a very Western web for a very long time. We've not concentrated so much on those things. So it's nice to see this stuff included in a big project like this, being inclusive of those different languages. And then we have viewport units. Now, developers often have issues with the viewport, in particular with mobile devices. On the desktop, it tends to be fairly straightforward, but mobile devices all do weird stuff with bars appear, and, the viewport isn't exactly what it might be when you're first looking at a page loading. The minute, a URL bar or something appears, the viewport is reduced. And there's all sorts of stuff going on with different browsers on different mobile devices. So in values and units level 4, there are new units that describe the largest, smallest, and dynamic viewport. And implementing these is included in Interop 2022. So hopefully that's going to go some way to solving some of the problems around viewports when you're building sites and applications for mobile. And then finally, we have this sort of vague section called Web Compat. Now, what this does is it rounds up a few issues that have caused site compatibility problems. So this is really where, a site is reporting that they are broken in one browser, and it comes down to some bug or what have you. And so there's a few things kind of tied up in that are coming up and should be fixed. Now, also on that list, there's some areas that are listed as under investigation. Now, this includes editing with content editable, pointer and mouse events, and viewport measurement. Now, these are things where we know people are having problems. We're seeing the problems. They're getting reported to us. But right now, maybe we don't have a good enough specification, or we don't have enough tests in order for us to include it in the project. There's something that needs to be figured out, really. And so for each of these, there's a smaller group of people, with people from all the vendors and other sort of parties, are spending time discussing, figuring out what the problems are. And then, do we need a better spec? Do we need tests? Do we need something completely new to fix this? That's kind of what's happening. Hopefully some of those things could be added to next year's project if we can get them into shape so that we actually know what we're trying to fix. So that's the areas of investigation. And I think this stuff is just exciting. Even the sort of the things you think, well, that's a little trivial thing. I'm never going to encounter that. But actually all of these things are things that people are running into. And you might not have run into them yet, but the next project will be the one where it becomes the big issue that everyone's trying to work around. So each little fix, there's masses of tests, that are currently failing and then are going to start to pass. And, each of those fixes is something else that you and another developer don't run into. But also, each new feature that lands cross-browser makes so much more possible. Each thing is a multiplier. If we get Subgrid, that's going to make Grid better. It's going to make other things better. What about when we get Subgrid and we get container queries? How many things are then going to be enabled? How much creativity have we got? How many problems can we solve? Each of these things as it comes together with other things. And that to me is sort of the most exciting thing about this stuff. It gets out into the world and then you start seeing the code pen demos and you start seeing what people are doing. And it's stuff that I never would have thought about. From where I sit, my background as a developer is very much building interfaces for content management systems. It's not a creative world so much as a sort of a problem solving in a UI world. And then I see what people are doing creatively. Each of these things just makes it better, and it makes it better in different ways, whether that's creativity or whether that is just being able to create a faster, more performant website. And so, we're halfway through the year and thoughts might start turning to, well, what's going to be an Interop 2023? I mean, there's already a tracking issue. There's not a lot there yet because, we haven't quite got to the planning stage. But it's vital that we do have tests. So, having stuff well tested is going to be important. And also that, you are out there and raising bugs and letting us know what it is that needs fixing. So if you want to influence what is in Interop 2023, make sure that the bugs are out there, that they're logged against browsers. If you're running into something and you can't find a bug, log it. If it's a duplicate, it's okay. That just shows that there is interest in that. If you can't actually find the exact bug, never be afraid to raise a browser bug. If the bug is there, star it. Show that you're interested in having that. Because that's going to help with the planning. You can also just post directly to that Interop 2022 repo, the tracking issue there. There's already been, there was a thread on Twitter where someone was talking about something they wanted. That's already been picked up and tracked so we don't lose track of it when it actually comes down to the decision making. Do sort of get yourself involved. If the stuff that is a problem in your project, you might be the person who's really running into that. Let us know about it so we can make it better. Because I hope you can see how much effort people are putting in to try to make things better for developers. So, do keep raising bugs. Do keep sharing where things are tripping you up and help us to make the web measurably better next year. Thank you very much. This is why I fall off a stool.
Yeah, they're a little tall, huh? Even for a tall guy like me, still just barely brushing it. All right, well, thank you for the great talk, Rachel. First of all, thank everybody for putting questions through on the website. You can also tweet at them using the CSS Day hashtag, and we'll find them there as well. So we got a couple of questions from the audience here, though I'm going to start with mine because I'm up here. So you linked in their last slide about the Interop 2023 effort and the new topics they'll be going over there. What is your current favorite for being worked on?
Ooh, well, I think I'd probably get chased out of the room if I didn't say container queries. So, but I think, yeah, I think yes. Hopefully we're going to be at a point where that could be, because that needs to be everywhere and it needs to be solid. And it needs to behave as people expect. So yeah, I think just in terms of, it's a very obvious answer, but having spent so many years saying, nah, that's not possible, it's going to be really, really nice to actually have that.
I, too, was one of those people who was like, I don't think that's ever going to happen. And then it happened, and people proved me wrong, and I'm so glad for it. All right, so a few questions from the audience. First off, SVG has not gotten a lot of love in the last several years. There's a bunch of open bugs that are 5, even 10 years old now. Do you know of any plans to make any SVG issues part of Interop stuff?
I don't, but that's a very good point. There are all sorts of issues that you see with that. So yes, maybe that would be something to discuss. It's very CSS heavy at the moment, and I think there's definitely other places. We should add it to the list. Yeah,
somebody go ahead and just drop an issue right now. Tom is the one who asked that. Your responsibility now, Tom. Another question from, I'm not sure if it's the same Tom or not. What allowed something as kind of fundamental as Cascade Layers to land seemingly everywhere at the same time? Was that any part of this sort of effort, or was it something else?
I think for one thing, from having spoken to a few people, it was something that was not as complex to do as some other things that people desperately want. So it was something that engines could do. I mean, this is it's a big part of it. It's like there's lots of things we'd like to do, but if it's going to burn up like years of time and nothing else could get done, it's probably not going to happen. So that it's kind of like that was something that could be done. But again, I think it wouldn't have been useful if it wasn't everywhere. And so to actually, in terms of can we implement this? Yes. That's important to get that yes, I think, from everywhere for a feature like that. We have to know that everyone can do it and it's spec'd in a way that everyone can do it. Because it wouldn't be useful if it was just in one engine.
All right, final question here. Getting all these new features in the browser and make them useful, make them interoperable is very great, but an important part of web development is being able to inspect these things, being able to see them in the dev tools. Is anything about that sort of effort part of Interop, or is that something separate?
Yeah, not so much, but I think that generally, I mean, these days, typically things are landing in DevTools at the same time as we get the feature. That's generally something that's happening. I think so. In most cases, that is just the case anyway, that we land a feature, and it also, we've got sort of DevTools for Cascade Layers and things already. So I think that's generally, it's not so much explicit, I don't think, but it is happening anyway, more and more.
Also note, if y'all have any specific DevTools requests, our speaker, Adam Argyle, is going to be here tomorrow. Would be good to direct questions to, at least about Chrome DevTools. Okay. Thank you very much, Rachel. Wonderful talk.
Thank you.